right. Let's have a roll call.
Commissioner Yates?
Here.
Commissioner Edgar?
Here.
Commissioner Neely?
Here.
Commissioner Pauley?
Here.
Commissioner Mum?
Here.
And Chair Roth?
Here.
You forgot, Rob.
And? I'm here.
Commissioner Smith? I apologize.
Just right over the top.
Unless there's been a change, though. I could go home.
Citizens' comments. Do we have citizens?
I have none.
No
Yeah.
citizens' comments. Okay, are we going quickly through this, huh? Adoption of the agenda.
Move to adopt.
No changes?
No change.
Okay. No motion necessary.
Okay. Urban Renewal Presentation 201. Eric.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We had a request earlier in the year to have an Urban Renewal 201, just to kind of cover the basics and talk about where we are today with the new the measure that was passed in November and how we can work within that. I've invited Elaine Howard of Elaine Howard Consulting to give us her expert advice and take us through a edification, I guess, exercise. So with that, unless you have any questions, I've got Elaine here, and I think she's ready to present, so I'll just ask her to do that.
Is this already on? I need to do anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
So I'm Elaine Howard. I have a consulting firm that for the past 7 years I've concentrated strictly on working on urban renewal with different cities across the state of Oregon. And prior to that, a few years ago, I worked for the Portland Development Commission for about 10 years doing urban renewal projects. And then I also do private development, so I know development from both sides of the public and private side. But for the last 7 years, I've been just strictly working with cities on urban renewal. So I'll go through this. If you have any questions as I go through, feel free to stop me and ask a question. It's not back to the very basics. It's a 201, not a 101. So
We requested that. We want to see another 101.
So it will tell you, it'll answer some of the questions that I've been given by Eric about questions you had, and those will come as we go through. And then there's a basic presentation, and then at that point I'll stop and see how much time we have. I have a number of other slides after that that are projects that other cities have done. And a lot of times city councils or commissions are really interested in those, and if you have time, they like to see them because they like to see what's going on. So you can advise me at that point how much more you feel you want to hear from me. So what is urban renewal? It's a program that is authorized through the Federal 1949 Housing Act. It was authorized for state statutes in 1951 and authorized for cities in 1957. It is a program that was set up to address blighting influences in specifically designated areas of cities or counties. It's used throughout Oregon, and what it does is provide a funding mechanism to implement city plans, and it uses the increase in property taxes to fund projects in the area. So this is a map my staff put together that shows where urban renewal is used in the state of Oregon, and it is widely used, as you can see, all up and down the coast. The cities use it, the I-5 corridor, clear out to La Grande, Klamath Falls on the south end. You can see if it's green, they have one urban renewal area. If it's light blue, they have two. If it's pink, they have three. And of the small cities, Lebanon, Bend, and Klamath Falls each have 3. And then Salem has 7, and the Portland Development Commission has 11. So it's used widely across the state of Oregon. This is your particular urban renewal area and the boundary map, so I just thought I would put that in. If anybody wants to come back and reference that at any point, we can come back to it. So obviously it includes your downtown core and the more industrial, commercial properties up to the north. So what is blight? Blight is actually defined by the statute, and even though every time I work with the city, they really hate me using that word blight because nobody wants to admit that they have blight in their cities, it is what you have to use if you're going to establish an urban renewal area. It generally covers underdevelopment or underutilization of property, so property that isn't fully developed or isn't developed to the capacity that it should be to able to pay its fair share of property taxes. It covers poor condition of buildings, inadequacy of infrastructure, including streets and utilities. And those are typically, when I work with cities, the findings of blight that we cover. There are limitations on urban renewal, so for a city with a population of under 50,000 like yours, you may only have 25% of your total assessed value in urban renewal, and you may only have 25% of your total acreage in urban renewal. There are also existing plan limitations for any existing plan that you have. You may never increase it by more than 20% of the original plan acreage. So if you had 100 acres to begin with, you may never increase that plan to more than 120 acres. If you want to do more urban renewal than that, you need to start a new urban renewal area. You also may not increase your maximum indebtedness by more than 20% of your original maximum indebtedness index for inflation. You guys have done recently a maximum indebtedness increase a few years ago, and your maximum indebtedness is $130,100,000. So it's very healthy maximum indebtedness. A lot of cities this size, having a little larger area, have a much lower maximum indebtedness than that. So it is a healthy amount of maximum indebtedness. Maximum indebtedness, again, is the total amount of money that you may spend on administration, projects, and programs during the life of your urban renewal area. It is the controlling factor of urban renewal. It used to be that urban renewal plans had to have sunset dates. They had to have dates by which they terminated. When measures 5, 47, and 50 came into effect and all of the property tax calculations got changed, urban renewal also got changed at that point, and maximum indebtedness became the controlling feature. So a lot of plans had to go in and either establish maximum indebtedness or, and at the same time that they established their maximum indebtedness, they typically got rid of the timeline for expiration. So that left maximum indebtedness as the controlling factor of urban renewal. How is a plan adopted or a substantial amendment approved? It is approved through a process that's prescribed in the statute, so you have to have public input, you have to have a planning commission review to make sure it conforms to your comprehensive plan, you have to give notice to all the citizens in your city, and you have to have it done by a non-emergency ordinance, so it's not effective for 30 days after it's voted on. How does urban renewal financing work? First, an area is designated as an urban renewal area, and at the point that it's designated as an urban renewal area, the assessor does something called freeze the base. So the assessor then will calculate the total assessed value of that urban renewal area, and at that point says this is what's called the frozen base of this urban renewal area, and all the taxing jurisdictions continue receiving the taxes off of that frozen base for the life of your district. But any increase in value in that urban renewal area, the taxes off of that increase go to the urban renewal agency for funding projects and programs within the area. So this is what that looks like in concept. The blue across the bottom is that frozen base of a potential urban renewal area. The taxes off that go to all the taxing jurisdictions. The orange up above is what goes in increment to the urban renewal area. You can see out on what I have is year 26. This is something that's new in legislation, and in this particular urban renewal area for which I did this chart, it shows revenue sharing with the taxing jurisdictions. In 2009, there was some new legislation adopted by the legislature that changed ORS 457. And what it did was it said that at any time you substantially amend after 2009 your urban renewal area, or you establish a new urban renewal area, you then are required to do revenue sharing at the point that you earn 10% of your original maximum indebtedness in your annual tax revenues. So if the amount annually that you get from the assessor equals 10% of what your original maximum indebtedness was of your urban renewal area, you begin sharing a portion of that with all the taxing jurisdictions. That was something the different taxing districts lobbied for because they were unhappy that sometimes really successful urban renewal areas didn't ever share that increase or growth in the taxes with them until the end of the district, and sometimes the districts went on, and so they never saw a share. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like you to back up on that, because I guess I never thought that the the increase in the increment ever went back to the taxing jurisdiction other than the urban renewal district until it closed out. So could you, I got lost a little bit.
Okay,
Could
this
you
is
go
something
through it
new,
again?
and your district won't do this unless you do a substantial amendment
Mm-hmm.
or unless you do a new district. Okay?
Okay.
So
Now-
your district doesn't have revenue sharing
Yeah.
unless you would do a substantial amendment or if you
So
started
if
a
you
new
could tell us
district.
again, go through the.
I will.
Because I wasn't ready for anything like that. Could you go
Okay,
through it again?
yep.
If I understand correct, our frozen base originated from 1977. Even it was perpetuated from that given date. And I don't know if somebody could ever prove or tell me, but that was
It would
my
start from
understanding.
whenever your urban renewal plan was adopted in
That was
Erie, was that
1992.
But it was,
1992?
it was adopted, actually in 90, there was one, but but the base that they used in 90 was the same as they had in 1977. And I don't see that it was ever substantially changed. And I'm trying to get that clarified. That was my understanding in talking to the assessor's office.
Was it the two separate districts, the hilltop and the down?
Yeah, they were.
Yeah, but this was the original, I looked at the 1990 plan, but the number that they started with appeared like it was the same as when the base was frozen in 1977. And so we just kind of moved on and just used the same number and just started a new plan at that time. But the point is, we've gone a long time.
Right,
And-
without releasing increment.
Without releasing any increment, period. And if in fact that's a true statement, and I would love to get that really
I'll have
verified.
to research that, and I can verify that. But I'll have to-
Please.
Yeah.
So I'm going to address that quickly with what another city has done, and then I'll come back and answer this question. So the city of Wilsonville at one point made a commitment to their residents with one of their urban renewal areas that they would never collect over X amount of money annually. And they said if we ever collect over X amount of money, we will return that money, the rest of that, to the taxing jurisdictions. So until 2009, what they used to do is annually they would reduce the acreage in the urban renewal area to make it equal, roughly, that amount of increment that they said they wouldn't exceed. So it was a cumbersome process, but they had made this commitment, and that was the only way they were able to do it. Now, with the 2009 legislation, there's another point in that legislation which allows every urban renewal agency to do something which is called under levy, which means you don't have to take the full amount of increment that you're allowed to take. You may say, we'll only take X amount of that increment, and you can do that every year. You can change that amount or change how you want to do that. A couple of agencies have done that. Nobody's done it. No, Wilsonville is doing it permanently. They're saying for this district, and I'm going to use a number here, but you may not quote me on it because I'm not totally sure. Let's just say, I think it was $2 million. And they said, when we get $2 million annually, we'll never take more than that. So they've told the assessor, from this certain district, we'll only take $2 million, and the rest of that you get to turn back to all the taxing jurisdictions. So the other thing the 2009 legislation did was said, if your original maximum indebtedness, do you remember what your original was before you increased it in 2007?
About 30.
No, it was 90 something, I think.
Let's just say it was 90, okay? At the point, if it was 90 million, at the point that you get $9 million annually, which would be 10% of that 90, you then have to start sharing that with the taxing jurisdictions. You only have to do that if you do a substantial amendment or if you start a new plan. So your plan right now, your amendment was in 2007 or 2008. It doesn't apply to that. If you do another substantial amendment in the future, and only two things are substantial amendments, that's increasing the acreage over 1% or increasing your maximum indebtedness. If you do either of those two things, that throws you into that revenue sharing.
So could this
Arena.
commission, by resolution, adopt some revenue sharing thing now without adopting a new plan?
You may. You may do that through an under levy. However, I always like to caution commissions, you obviously may have debt that is a requirement. You've incurred debt, so there are covenants in that debt, so you have to look at those covenants to make sure they allow you to do that. They may not allow you to do that. You may have contracts with developers or other entities, so you have to honor everything that you have. And then, if you honor everything you have and you look at what projects you want to do in the future and you have excess money on an annual basis, or even just one time, I worked with the City of Lebanon, and we did an amendment. It was a 4-year amendment. For that particular year, they didn't need all of that money. The taxing jurisdictions asked them, could you underlevy it then? And they agreed to underlevy for 1 year because they didn't need it until the following year. And it didn't make their plan go longer. So, they looked at their own financial needs and said, yes, that makes sense. We can do that for you. So you just have to always look out for what your projects are and plans are in your existing urban renewal plan.
Our original, when we established this one in 1990, let's say, and our base, our maximum indebtedness was $30 million. And now, then we, in let's say 2007, changed to $130 million. But because we're still working off of that original plan, and it was $30 million.
No, they amended the plan.
But they amended the plan, but is that amendment,
so if you amended your plan again and did a substantial amendment.
And added the $100 million.
No. If from here forward you decide to change your plan and either add acreage or add new maximum indebtedness, you would go back to what that original maximum indebtedness is, and let's say it was $30 million. I'm sorry, but I don't know for sure. So your revenue sharing would start, if that was $30 million, your revenue sharing would start at any point that you annually get $3 million of tax increment revenues.
Huh.
So,
if that in fact was what the original was
Right.
was $30 million.
right,
Then anytime we go over $3 million
annually,
annual in revenue,
right,
then we could or we should.
you will.
You will.
Only if we amend the plan.
Only if you amend the plan.
From this point on.
From this point
From
on.
this
From this
point
point
on.
on, right.
Right.
Not
We're
historic.
not
It's
going
a-
backwards, though.
If you don't do any substantial amendments to the plan, that provision of the legislation doesn't impact you at all. So I know I was asked a couple of questions because there was some thoughts about maybe making some changes to your plan. So I thought it was important to talk about that, because if you do make changes where you add over 1% acreage, that makes it a substantial amendment, and that would bring in those revenue sharing requirements.
And what is it set at, the revenue sharing? Is it set at a percentage, or is that?
There's a set percentage, and I don't have all of that memorized, but it's in the statute, and it'd be very easy for me to follow up with Eric and say exactly what that is.
So if we were to create a second urban renewal district, nothing to do with the one we currently have, and throw in $50 million in debt for that one, wouldn't affect the existing one at all.
No, it would not.
But if we took any property out of the existing one, when we formed it, we have to really have a total plan revision to over the existing one in order to alter the one. The hypothetical thing is we decide to create one for what we call the Blue Heron site.
Right.
And we want to include the office building that's currently part of the downtown urban renewal plan. But to do that, to take that office building and make it all part of the Blue Heron site, I have to now revise the existing plan.
That's correct.
To pull that building out, and then when I do that, then I
That won't trigger this requirement, because
will
you're
not
not
trigger-
adding, you're subtracting.
I'm okay. It's because I'm subtracting. Okay.
Just as long as we're doing it, Paul.
You'll obviously have to do new financial projections for your existing plan to be able to show that you can cover your existing debt requirements in your existing plan if you remove acreage. And again, you'll have to look at your bond covenants to make sure what do you have outstanding bonds? I believe.
so pay off in
You'd have to look at those
2028.
bond covenants and make sure they allow you to remove acreage. And sometimes they don't allow you, but you can negotiate back with them about making a change to that. So it's a complicated matter to take acreage out, but it can be done.
What if we wanted to take the existing urban renewal area? We see one area is pretty well developed. We'd like to see that go back on the tax rolls. Other is not. We don't change the overall area of the urban renewal district, but we split it in two pieces. What happens, or do you know?
Well, if you
But
say
it's
you
the same
don't
size.
change the existing area, that means,
But you split it into two districts.
okay,
And one that you'll close earlier, say, and one that you're going to leave open for a longer period of time. What happens then?
well, if you form a new district, which you would be if you split them,
Then
your new district would be, and those revenue sharing requirements aren't onerous, so it's not something to worry about. They work well, and they actually, I think, are the right thing to do. But it would mean that your new district would have revenue sharing requirements.
Which would be
The
both of
district
them.
that if you kept one district and eliminated
That's
area
not what I was
from it.
talking about, though.
So you're going to close it all down
We're
and
gonna
start
s-
two
we're-
new districts.
Can we split, if we form two districts out of the one that already exists? Is that like starting two new districts?
Okay, it depends on what way you do it. You could do it two ways. You could close down your whole existing district, put all that money back on the tax rolls, start two new districts. I would advise against doing that because whenever you start a new district, this is what happens.
Yep.
Your tax revenues are really low at the beginning, but you have that blue kind of shows what projects you want to do and what debt service you want to incur. And you start a new district, so your frozen base goes up to what your tax values are now, and your ability to do projects. New districts usually wait 5-10 years before they have enough money coming in to do projects. So, not knowing your whole political dynamic, but what I would say is, why don't you reduce the size of one district, but keep it active so that you still have increment coming in to do projects. So you reduce the size of that, so you still have one functioning district, but you're able to put
Close the other.
what you take out of that back on the tax rolls and then start over if you want on that district. But when you start over, this money over in this district can't be used over there. It can only be used in the district that it's in. So, you would have to look at whatever acreage it is and say, okay, we don't need a lot of money for a few years, so we're able to put stuff back on the tax rolls, start over, let it grow a while, knowing that in the future we'd be able to tap that. But if you close it down completely, you're going to be in this scenario with both districts, which may be what you want to do. I don't know, but
If I understood correctly, when they did the change to the Clackamas Town Center Urban Renewal District, the fire district got them to pull some of the buildings out, some of the area out of it, to put it back on the tax rolls. So they kind of gerrymandered everything together to create new revenue to cover some of the
taxing jurisdictions lost.
taxing jurisdictions during that
Right,
effort.
Right. I've never worked on that plan, but that's exactly what Wilsonville did. What I was saying is that way, by reducing acreage or limiting the amount of money they get, more money goes back to the taxing jurisdiction. So they did it, a different way. So yes, you can do that. If you are looking at what your annual revenues are and you don't need that amount of annual revenue, and you think that the wise thing is to return some of that to taxing jurisdictions, there are different ways you can look at what you're doing to be able to do that.
It sounds like revenue sharing would be the least complicated of that.
Or reducing the site.
And it seems to me and of course, I've heard, 5 minutes of this, so I would want to look at it more than that. But the least complicated way is to under levy each year.
Which is
to
revenue
say,
sharing? Is that
well, in a sense, that's
Okay.
revenue sharing, but it's really called under levy because each year you get this UR50 form from the assessor, you fill it out, you send it back, and so they tell you what amount of money you could get, and you say what amount of money you want to get, and the rest of that goes to the taxing jurisdictions. The thing that may be difficult to the taxing jurisdictions about doing an under levy is they don't have any certainty that you'll do that every year. So it might be a bonus to them one year, but they don't know for sure. You can do a permanent under levy, and then they would have certainty. You can tell the assessor, and this is what Wilsonville did. We're never going to take more than $2 million. Again, I'm making that number up. $2 million every year. So then all the taxing jurisdictions know, okay, when we do our budgeting, we know this amount's going to urban renewal and the rest of that's coming back to us, and then we can budget for that. We can know that it's coming. So the other question you have is, how in the world does the assessor decide how much money actually comes to us on an annual basis, and why is it on the property tax bill? And those are two really good questions. And this shows you kind of in concept what might happen. So what the assessor does every year is takes the values of all the properties within the urban renewal area and totals those up, the assessed values, and gets a total number. And then he takes the frozen base, which was established when the area was established, and he subtracts that frozen base from that total value and gets what's called excess value, and applies the permanent rate to that excess value and comes up with a number of how much taxes the urban renewal agency will get. And this is the really confusing part, and this happened because Shiloh Inn sued the City of Portland and the Portland Development Commission. And they said that urban renewal ought to be calculated under the $10 per thousand general government tax limitation, and not split between the $5 per thousand school and the $10 per thousand general government. It makes a difference in calculating compression. That's why. That's the difference that it makes. They won that lawsuit. And what the court system did and what the Department of Revenue did upon administration of them winning that lawsuit was said to the assessors, you have to spread that total amount of taxes that come out of your urban renewal area to every taxpayer's bill within your locality. So if it's a county, within the county. If it's a city, it's within the city. It doesn't mean their taxes go up. It just means their taxes are divided so that a portion of that goes to urban renewal. So the concept is you figure out what the total value is in the area, figure out the taxes from that, you spread those taxes to every property tax bill. So if you look at this property tax bill, it's just, if you ever want to look at what the impact is to the different taxing jurisdictions, the assessor has a table called a SAL Table 4E. And in Clackamas County, I believe that's on their website. And you could go into that and look at that and see what the impacts to the different taxing jurisdictions are. So I'm going to go to this table and then I'm going to go back to that slide. So if the amount for this particular property, if they have to raise $46.57 for this particular property as their portion of that urban renewal, this is what a tax bill might look like for them with urban renewal and without urban renewal. So the first column is the $103,000 value of their property, and these are the different permanent tax rates. And it shows that if you didn't have urban renewal, Clackamas County would get $247.63 from that property. But if you have urban renewal, Clackamas County is only going to get $240.42. And if you look at that very bottom line, the $1,598.95, it's the same with or without urban renewal. On the last column, which unfortunately there's a 4 up there, urban renewal gets $46.57 out of that. And they get that from all of those other permanent rates decreasing a little bit. So with or without urban renewal, for your permanent rates, the property tax payer doesn't pay any more. It's just divided differently. It's very complicated. So
That has been a big point that has been brought to us many times. That
and I developed for the city of Gold Beach a little handout that I could revise with this for you guys that explains how that works. And it's still really confusing, but at least people can read it and there is an explanation, right?
Right.
And there's an answer instead of people saying, well, gosh, I don't know, and it's really complicated.
Right.
It at least walks them through it and says, this is what happens and why. And people may not be able to track that, but at least it's an answer, right?
Absolutely.
And, so I think it's really helpful. You guys have an...
I don't really understand from the Shiloh lawsuit what the impact is on Oregon City or any other urban. What does it mean that Shiloh Inn won in terms of how this is divvied up? Who wins? Who loses?
All state statutes
Who
can
wins? Who
be...
loses?
Well, let me go through this. All state statutes can be modified by legal actions, right? So if there's a state statute and there's a lawsuit and somebody wins or loses that lawsuit, then the interpretation of the statute can be changed, right? So there was a statute that talked about how you divide, how you get urban renewal funds. Shiloh Inn said, we don't think you're administrating that statute correctly, so we're going to challenge that. And the judge said, we agree. We think that they aren't administering it correctly. And therefore, we're going to set rules for how an assessor has to administer that statute. So who really won on that? Shiloh Inns probably paid less overall taxes because their property, I don't know if Shiloh Inns ever, if they won. They were trying to make a point about urban renewal. So I think it was more of a philosophical and political challenge than Shiloh Inns actually getting any money out of it. But they said, you measure 47 and 50 established this $10 per thousand limit on taxes and this $5 per thousand limit on school taxes. And urban renewal has to be figured into there somehow, and we think you're doing it wrong.
You're essentially taking those percentages for each one of those and putting them in a different category.
That's correct. So, bonds. Bonds are different than permanent rate levies. And you are what's called an option 1 reduced rate plan. And there are a lot of different kinds of urban renewal plans just to make it really tricky. And they can be really confusing. But you're an option 1 reduced rate plan. A reduced rate plan means you don't get to take any division of taxes for bonds and local option levies that were passed after 2001. But bonds that were passed before 2001, you take a portion of that bond money. And on the last 2012-2013 assessment, your urban renewal area got $232,752 of bond proceeds. So that's different from the permanent rate levy. So bond proceeds have a different impact. The permanent rate levy proceeds have an impact on the taxing jurisdictions. The bond proceeds have an impact on the property owner. Because to be able to pay your bond payments, the school district needs to know they're going to get the amount, the full amount. They can't get less to make their bond payments. So what happens on bonds is the impact of that is spread to all of the property tax owners. It's usually a very minimal amount. And when you did your last amendment, I was looking through those documents today, there was a bit of a calculation on what that amount actually was. So you could look back into that amendment, the report on that amendment, and see what they calculated. But sometimes we consultants say urban renewal doesn't raise taxes. And there's a caveat with that. It does raise taxes if you're taking money out of bonds that were prior to 2001. It's usually a small amount, but you need to acknowledge that that does happen. And that tax rates will go up because of the amount of money you take. The actual tax rate on that bond goes up a little bit on property tax owners. Everybody got that? Mm-hmm. So, do I need to go through that anymore? It's very confusing, and I don't mind running through it again if anybody wants me to hit it again.
It's clear as mud.
Clear as mud, it is.
So the bonds are separate from
yes,
the urban
bonds are separate from the permanent rates.
Yeah.
permanent rates. Got it. Okay.
But that date is 2001.
That's correct. Most local option levies, they're usually 10 years, right? So we're past 10 years from 2001, would be 2011. So most agencies don't get anything from local option levies anymore, right? And if they're a reduced rate plan. If a school district has a bond, and instead of that bond going to maturity, they decide to refund or refinance that bond, if the original issue date was prior to 2001, they're still under this legislation that allows you to take some of it. And I've worked with, for example, the city of Albany. They don't want to take that money, right? But they don't have a choice. The way the legislation is written right now, they don't have a choice. If they under levy, the money goes back to each taxing jurisdiction by their permanent rate and to the bond. So they can't just say, okay, school district, we want to give you your bond money back. They're not allowed to do that. There is some legislation in the legislature right now that would make a change to that. And people who are interested in urban renewal are tracking that. It's moving very slowly, and there have been different legal challenges to it already. But cities who are taking that bond money really feel like they shouldn't be taking that bond money, and they want that legislation to pass that would allow them not to take, because I think you have the fire district, you have a city bond, you have a school district bond, I think there's a county bond. So all of that money is coming to you instead of going to do whatever the bond passed for it to go to. So it's an awkward situation. Hopefully that legislation will pass, and then we can deal with that. So, the impacts of urban renewal are mostly on the taxing jurisdictions. They continue receiving taxes on the frozen baits. They forego taxes on the growth in the area. There's always that but for urban renewal question, which is if you didn't invest in that community, would that growth have happened anyway? And a lot of times you can say, no, it wouldn't have, because the amount of money that we put in has caused a development to be feasible, and it's caused that growth to happen.
The catalyst.
And hopefully when you have an urban renewal area and you're making improvements here, because in that urban renewal area you're making improvements, the areas outside of that, where everybody's getting all their full taxes off of it, will increase in value too, because you're doing nice things to your city, your community's improving, your overall tax rate is healthy, your values go up, and then everybody shares in that healthy atmosphere.
I understand that talking to one of the county commissioners, he was saying that they're looking at how to have maybe a percentage of public works projects or projects that do not increase assessed values, to have some type of limitation on projects. Because as an example, we do a big project that it doesn't increase assessed value, we create bonded debt or something like this goes out, and so we get into this gray area. What is the overall public benefit of a public works project? Does it truly bring in new assessments or increase assessed value? And
I've got a couple of slides here later. The city of Florence is doing a large public infrastructure project to provide water and sewer to property that's undeveloped. And yes, it will increase values because that property can't be developed unless you put that infrastructure in. So sometimes putting that infrastructure in is what you have to do to allow development to occur. In terms of the county commissioner saying they, I don't know who they is. There's nothing in the legislature to do that limitation. And that would be who would change the statutes. So if they might be the county's thinking about doing it for the county, then they could do that. You, in your annual budgeting process, can look at your plans and say X amount of money can go to this area of project, X amount to this. So you could make a decision about how you fund your own plans and say, well, we don't want to do more than this. But let me give you just an example of, sometimes I think saying never is blind. About 5 years ago, the city of Astoria hired me to help them with their downtown urban renewal plan. And they sent me a lot of documents. I hadn't been to Astoria in a long time, so I read through the documents. I was really surprised and dismayed that 55% of the area in their downtown was nonprofit. So they weren't getting any taxes off of 55% of the urban renewal area. And then the projects they had were projects going to the theater and to the community facility. And I looked at that and I thought, oh man, I'm going to have to go down there and straighten these guys out. Well, I went down there and learned a lot, because what they were doing was exactly what needed to happen in their city. They funded improvements to the Liberty Theater, which is an historic theater, beautiful theater. Those, and it operates over 300 and something days a year, so it brings people to downtown Astoria. So Elliott Hotel, which is across the street and up, renovated and put a couple $1 million worth of renovation on their own into their renovations. A number of new restaurants went in to service that theater crowd. So yeah, the Urban Renewal Agency funded something that didn't increase property values directly, but it definitely increased property values and the health of the city indirectly. And it was the same thing. So they've created a tourist destination. They, I have a great picture later in the slide. They're doing that something now called the Garden of Surging Waves, which is a commemoration of the Chinese immigrants and their work in Astoria. And the Chinese community in Portland has helped with that fundraising. And of course, once that gets built, the Asian community will travel to Astoria to see that. So they're creating this whole new niche of tourist trade, and it's not going to create any tax value, but it's going to create a lot of other value for the city. So you just have to be careful when you think about saying those kinds of things, because sometimes for your city it's absolutely the right thing to invest in things that don't produce actual increase in assessed value.
So it's not always tax increment. It could be increase in jobs. It could be
Absolutely.
Other types of things.
Absolutely.
Just
Brings
economic
tourists
stimulus.
in so your businesses flourish, and that provides jobs, and it provides more people who want to live in your community and have kids who support your schools, and so it all, there's a spin-off benefit from it. So 2009 legislation, we already talked about the revenue sharing. There are limits now on maximum indebtedness increases. If you increase over 20% of your original maximum indebtedness, you have to get concurrence from taxing jurisdictions, from 75% of them. So they have to approve. And up to that point, taxing jurisdictions never got to vote on anything that we all decided to do in urban renewal. So this gives them a vote if you decide you want to do over a certain amount. And then plans, that applies again to plans which have been amended since 2009 and new plans, and the ability to under levy. So those were the provision of the 2009 legislation. And then what types of projects are typically completed? You guys have done a number of those. So streetscape projects, public art projects, catalyzing development, storefront loans, parks, plazas, placemaking. This is the farmers market on Millennium Park in Lake Oswego. The other is Park in Wilsonville. So again, those things didn't do actual increment increases there, but it brings, farmers market in Lake Oswego brings 8,000 people every weekend to their community. So you get the spin-off benefit from that. In Wilsonville, they provided a place for kids. They they like their town to be known as a family town, right? So in their parks, they have definitely created those places for kids to help make sure people feel comfortable bringing their kids downtown. Redevelopment projects, working with private developers. This is one in the Dalles, so I have just a few here that are on projects, and then we'll go through your goals and objectives. So these are just saying the basic categories of projects. So this is at Brewery Grade, which is on the east end of the Dalles, and on the bottom part, that was a flour mill that was old, dilapidated, looked horrible. Inside, it's now a winery, and next door is a brewery. So it's bringing new tourist trade to the community, acts as an anchor to that east end of the town. This is another project the Dalles did where they worked with the state of Oregon. They did low-income housing up on top, but it was a beautiful hotel. They renovated the ground floor retail spaces, so that's an active, alive downtown retail area with housing on top. Storefront improvements are really popular. You guys have done some of those too. Most downtown commercial areas that have urban renewal do some kind of storefront improvement programs. So we also talked about wanting to go through your core values, and I don't know if you want me to walk through these, or do you want to walk through them?
Go ahead, you got them. I don't.
So
have
you
anything
recently
prepared,
did
so-
looking at your urban renewal area and establish what your core values were, and so I just put them on here so that we could go through them. So the things that were important to you were return on investment, both qualitative and quantitative, cultivating resources, processes, and investment in underutilized or affected areas, make the urban renewal district a destination, job creation, both permanent and temporary, economic development, and historical and cultural interpretation. So those were established as your core values. And then an issue that's relevant for you, and not all cities have this, is the measure that passed in the last election that you have a need to get voter approval for bonded indebtedness. So that puts a burden on you to make sure that whatever you're doing is something you feel like you can get votes for. Because if you need to incur debt, bonded indebtedness to do those projects, you need to have the city voters approve that. It's a step further than getting your urban renewal plan adopted, and a few cities have that requirement that to get an urban renewal plan adopted, you have to have a vote of the citizens. Corvallis has that. They don't have a plan now. They're thinking about doing one. Beaverton just adopted a plan with voter approval. So it's another step beyond that, and the issue that I always find is whenever you go out to voters and you talk about debt, you talk about money, you need to make sure that you can describe it really well and describe really well why they want to vote for it. I worked on a project in Lake Oswego last year on the Boones Ferry Road. It was an urban renewal area that we put together for them. And it was a package of financing, both with urban renewal, but also required a GO bond that had to be voted on. So it's not this specifically, but the whole development was really spurred by the business owners along Boones Ferry Road, the whole urban renewal plan. They were very active in working on the plan with me, developing the goals and objectives, identifying what we were going to spend the money on. And they did all of the lobbying for the bond levy, and it passed. And the interesting thing for us was the bond levy for the road passed. There was another bond levy for the library, and it did not pass. So you can do projects, you can still do your work. You just have to make sure that what you're doing is what the community wants you to do.
Now that we do have this bonded indebtedness vote obligation, the distinction between urban renewal and just having a GO bond is reduced somewhat because you have to go to the voters for each. Is there a significant rate advantage in your experience for going with for a GO bond to finance a similar kind of thing as opposed to going for an urban renewal bond?
I'm not the best person to ask that question. I can give you some general points, but I'm not a bond attorney and I don't place
Well,
bonds.
then beyond that, is there, in your experience, what's the real value of an urban renewal commission when you've got to go to the voters?
Well,
Anyway.
you still have the ability to use this. The bond
What can you do
is paid for out of this tax increment. So the money that you get out of your tax increment revenues pays for that bond, even though the voters have to approve it. It's not going to increase their property tax bill like a GO bond is. So they have to approve that you do it, but it's not going to increase their bill. So the benefit of having urban renewal is you're able to get these monies to concentrate activities in certain areas in your city, to make improvements to improve your city that you otherwise wouldn't have that money. You wouldn't have the ability to put that money together and concentrate it. If you did away with urban renewal and you just did it out of your city budget, right? So let's go back and look at the city tax rate compared to the total tax rate. Somebody may know this off the top of your head, and if you do, then I'm... So the city's tax rate is 4.159, but you're getting taxes off of, in that urban renewal area, you're getting 15.5238 plus the bond funds. So if you didn't have urban renewal, you'd be getting less than a third of that money. I mean, you could decide as a city, we're just going to dedicate the increases in that area out of the city taxes. We're going to figure out what that is, and we're going to dedicate it, and we're not going to take any taxing jurisdiction money. You could decide to do that, but you'd be getting less than a third of the amount of money you get if you do urban renewal. So you also looked at projects and identified short-term, mid-term, and long-term projects. So some of these have actually been done. The Amtrak train depot has been partially done. Maybe another phase to that?
We've got designs ready, so we haven't done the improvements yet.
So, and economic development opportunities at the north end, disposition development of infill properties, the transfer of the Stimson property as part of the jug handle project.
That issue's gone. We've completed that issue as well.
Okay. So midterm projects was the Blue Heron, and then long-term projects and urban renewal incentive program, potentially looking at terminating the district and forming smaller urban renewal areas, and explore economic development opportunities at the south end. So in terms of you're looking at what you want to do, that's what you've identified. So Eric gave me a couple of questions that you had, issues. Should the district be broken up into smaller districts? So just some reflection from me on that. Issues with that, and that doesn't mean it's pro or con, it's just something to think about, is if you have smaller districts, you have more administrative work to do because you do have requirements. You have to do an annual report. You have to do budgeting for that. You have to get a financial statement for that every year. So that you have administrative responsibilities. And if you break it up and go into smaller districts and totally get rid of that, you do reset the frozen base. You do give all that increment back to the taxing jurisdictions. But you start from ground zero. And you may be okay with that. You may not be. So you just need to know that that's what happens and that it's a few years then before you can actually do anything significant until you start getting increment. Alternatives would be, and I guess I wasn't totally sure of what the issue is. It sounds like part of your issue is you'd like to give some of that increment back. If it's just area planning, because it's so big and it's hard to plan for the different districts, you could set up different area planning and advisory groups just to work on separate districts within one larger district. And I know when I worked for the Portland Development Commission, and I've done some work for them in the past few years, that's part of what they do in their bigger districts, is they set up different groups to take a look at different issues within in that larger district. So that's one way. If it's just a planning issue, that's one way to address that. If it's the issue of wanting to give increment back, you have other choices. You can under levy, you can reduce some acreage and get that permanently off, or you could reduce to one small district and reform another district. So there are choices to look at. And obviously in looking at that, you'd want somebody to run some financial analysis for you to tell you what would happen in those. So are there any questions about that question? So should the urban renewal area be expanded? So issues are, you may not expand it over 20% of what your original acreage was. So you need to look at that calculation and see whether you had capacity, number one. You may not have over 25% of your total acreage in urban renewal, so you'd have to look at that. And if you expand over 1%, it requires a substantial amendment, and that then would put you into those revenue sharing requirements. So those are the administrative issues, and then the other issues are political issues. And
When you said expansion over 1%, was that land mass?
correct.
Okay.
And when you add, if you create a new district, do you have the 20% of the total land mass of the city? Is
25%.
25%, is that the only restriction?
25% of the total assessed value may not exceed either of those two.
We're not even close to any of that, are we?
Mm-mm.
So
I think you're right.
Well, right now we're at like 14.
That's what I was thinking too.
14 almost.
I could be wrong.
And so has anybody looked at Blue Heron and what that would do to that number? 14 to what, in terms of square footage, or?
No,
We're not in any danger of going over these
I don't
numbers,
think
though, I don't
so,
think.
no.
Are we? I don't think so either.
But I
Is there
think
anything else that you're
it would
aware
be-
of in terms of it creating an urban renewal district? Sounds like we can't amend the last one without really messing things up, so it sounds to me from what I've heard today that it's much more likely we'd create a new one. Is there anything that, any thoughts that you have as if we wanted to create an urban renewal area at Blue Heron, whether it should be an expansion or a new one, and then what restrictions would there be on the new one?
Let me give you I usually answer these questions from experience, right? So I worked recently in Lake Oswego on the Foothills proposed development. And it is just across 43 from the downtown, and the downtown is an existing urban renewal area. So we went through that same drill there, is we looked at, does it make more sense to add it into the existing district, to take some of the existing district out and put it with the Foothills district, or just do the Foothills district alone? So we did a feasibility study that included those three parameters and made a recommendation to the Urban Renewal Agency about which way we thought it worked best. In that particular case, there was high potential for development on that property in the Foothills area because it's riverfront property, same as your Blue Heron site. But there was a lot of infrastructure needs. So the city council would have had to have funded those infrastructure needs up front, and then when the development came, it would have repaid them, the model that we had, they would have repaid their general fund, or if they did general obligation bonds or whatever. But back to that line that I showed before, they had these needs down here, but their money was here, and so they didn't have enough. So it depends on what needs to be done to the site, and if you need money now to do it, and can the city front end that money or not. And if they can't front end that money and you want to get it from urban renewal, then you need to have an asset to be able to get that money. So that then says, well, maybe we bring it into our existing plan because we have money in our existing plan. So it gives us an ability to put money to that. So it really, it's a process of, we sat down with their city manager and their finance director and said, okay, what are your pots of money, and what out of those pots of money, what money do you want to allocate to this project? And that I would recommend is what you do also, is say, okay, if we put it in as its own urban renewal area, we know we aren't going to get money until it's developed because it's not increasing in value. So is the city going to fund it up front and get repaid out of urban renewal later? And if you don't have the capacity to do that, then you either need to put other properties with it, and those properties carry it, or you need to bring it into your existing area and let your existing area carry it. And it, the revenue sharing, it's not that big a deal, and you don't meet that threshold yet. So don't worry about that. It's something that happens, but don't let it scare you. It's not something to not do a substantial amendment because it's going to happen.
If I could just go back real quick, Phil, and finish answering your question. I did a really brief run of some numbers about a year ago on the Blue Heron site, as I recall now, and it wouldn't take it to the 20%, but it would be a 1%, and so it would be a substantial amendment if we were to include the Blue Heron.
Expansion over 1% of what?
Original acreage
Original.
of the urban renewal area.
If we created a new?
No. If we included Blue Heron.
Okay, got it.
So revenue sharing would kick in.
I understand.
And that's not a horrible thing. Don't let me scare you. I've gotten over it, but it's, it's minimal revenue sharing, and it works and makes everybody happy. And so don't let that be a reason that you decide not to do that. You would want to look at the numbers and see what it was, but I don't think it would be a reason for you to decide not to do it. How long does urban renewal last? Well, typically it's designed for a 20 to 25 year period. Sometimes it lasts longer. Yours has been around for a while.
Yes.
What happens after urban renewal? All the taxing jurisdictions get that increase in value, and hopefully it's caused areas of your city to improve, and it's caused other areas to also rise with those improvements that's happened in your urban renewal area. So that's my basic presentation, and I don't know how you are in time, and if you want to move to other things, or I can flip through other slides.
I don't know, but perhaps in the past, the Downtown Urban Renewal Agency has increased a certain percentage. I don't know if that's true or not over the existence. You mentioned the 20%. Is that 20% over existing? Does it have anything to do with the 1% expansions that have occurred in the past?
Yeah, all those add up to equal that 20%.
So when you're talking about the 20%, it would go back to the original size of the urban renewal district.
Right. So if your original acreage was 100 acres,
Yep.
you may never, no matter if you do them all in tiny increments,
You can't
have
exceed
more than
120.
120.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
And again, I worked with one city where it took me months to get them to understand that, because they kept saying, well, we took some acreage out. Well, that doesn't matter. You can't take acreage out and make that work. If you had 100 acres to start with, you can never go over that 120.
Any other questions?
I think Wyatt wanted to provide some clarification.
Chair Roth and Commissioner Yates, you asked a question about the perception for lenders on a GO bond versus an urban renewal debt, and there is a significant rate advantage to a GO bond. And the analogy that I'd use is simply, if a car lender were going to lend to a teenager, that would be the urban renewal. And if the parents came in and said, well, we've got this much money, even a responsible teenager. So generally across the United States and in Oregon as well, there's a feeling that urban renewal is a more risky investment than the GO guarantee of the community. So it's probably a rate impact of could be a whole percentage point or more.
3 instead of 4.
Which can be pretty significant on millions of dollars, as you know.
You can do urban renewal bonds with the city pledging their full faith and credit.
Really?
And then that solves that issue.
See, because I've really learned something tonight, because I always thought for years that the big deal of urban renewal was avoiding voting the vote. Just avoid the vote. Get all these bonds without having to go to the people. So we can. And what you've taught me tonight, which I really didn't know, so thank you, is that there's a significant advantage, another power play sort of. We get to take all the money from the fire district if we want to, without having to go. We still have to go to a vote, But if the people of Oregon City want to take it from the fire district, they can, and that's a significant advantage I wasn't really aware. And that's a big one. It's you get 3 times the revenue. That's a huge one, and I didn't appreciate that before tonight.
And the schools.
And the schools, of course, yeah. Fire just, but it seems to me the real issue for Blue Heron, and this will take 2 minutes, is it's such a big deal that I think the citizens of Oregon City might be willing to float a GO bond and get the better interest rate, because it's such a big deal and I just think that it's a popular enough thing that it would appeal to people outside the district itself. And it may be, I didn't realize, I think another important thing you taught us is we could do both. You can get the fire district, school district money, and the GO bond rate, since we've got to go to the voters anyway.
And one more distinction that Elaine pointed out, which I think is important, is the difference between a GO bond and the full faith and credit of the city. So a GO bond is defined in statutes as a vote of the people to increase their tax levy to pay for a bond. A full faith and credit of the city can be pledged by the commission without a vote of the people for most cities, but we're required to get a vote of the people because we have that charter language. But that wouldn't increase, a full faith and credit pledge wouldn't increase anyone's taxes. It would just be guaranteeing the loan, kind of like mom and pop guaranteeing the teenager's
Exactly,
loan.
and that gets us to 3% instead of the 4%, plus we get the benefits of having an urban renewal district. And it just seems to me that might be the way.
Let me clarify something about schools, as long as you brought schools up, because I hate to leave that out there. There's always questions about, well, are we taking directly from our schools? And no, you're not taking directly from your schools. What you're taking from is the Oregon State School Fund.
Right.
And that state school fund is allocated back on a per pupil basis to fund your schools. So the way your schools get more money is not by you increasing your property taxes directly, but by you getting more people to live in Oregon City who have kids who go to their schools. Right. That's how they'll get more money. And what I try to work with communities to understand is, if you increase or you make your downtown better, make at a place where kids want to live, make the amenities such that people want to move to your community, that's going to help your schools.
Now, is there a reimbursement? Now, my explanation that's been given to me is that the schools go to the state school fund and present the amount of money that is that have, through the division of taxes, they lost. It's kind of, then they get that not 100% dollar for dollar. They get approximately 90%.
Whoever gave you that explanation, it's a little different from that.
Okay.
So, all the tax money in the state goes to the state school fund.
Yes.
And it's not just the property tax money that funds the state school fund. There's lottery money that funds the state school fund, and there's some income tax money. And so the legislature, every time they meet, decides what that per pupil allocation is, and they decide that based on how much money they see is going to come into that fund, right? So in terms of people saying, well, they get that money back. Well, what they get back is money that is relevant to the amount of students they have in their school. And so there's, I have a letter that I got from a gentleman who works for the state school fund, and he made a similar argument to what you're making, which is, if there were more money if urban renewal went away in the state, and there was more money in the state school fund, potentially schools could get more money. But it also could be that the legislature would say, oh, there's more property tax money, we're not going to put as much income tax money in, or we're not going to put as much lottery money in, and they could say, you're still going to get only this amount per pupil, right?
Yeah.
So you can't guarantee that if urban renewal went away, all that money's going to go to the schools. The legislature decides what the schools get based on their per pupil allocation.
But still, it's a property tax that goes to the schools that feeds that fund.
That's correct.
That's right. So the increment we see there is still an increment that fails to go into that fund.
That's
but what you're
correct.
saying is that, well, that could be made up by some other thing, and it wouldn't make any difference.
I'm not saying it doesn't make any difference, because that would be
I mean, that could be the case.
But,
Yeah.
but it's part of a really complicated big
Right.
formula. And it's not the only funding source, and they aren't funded directly out of those total monies. Yes.
So a general obligation bond is only a property owner payback? Property taxes?
It becomes on your
So
tax bill.
a nonprofit or a government group that is not on the tax rolls will not pay, correct?
That's right.
So the burden is completely on the property owner.
The ones that are paying taxes.
But all of the nonprofits that we have in Oregon City, that's,
Yeah, but that's still true with urban renewal too. I mean,
I have a question. The per student reimbursement that comes out, is that flat across the state?
Yes.
So even if you're teaching in a district that is very inexpensive, you're...
You know, I'm not an expert
Yeah,
on
the
this
school
because
di-
I think
our
you
school
get.
district sued. I think it's equal now.
yeah, it's all equal.
'Cause there was
That's
a big
why they
lawsuit
did it that
about
way, is because if you have, I live in Lake Oswego, if you have a community that has a lot of property taxes, you know, they were thinking, well, we ought to get more back because we're putting more money in, and that's why they went to the per pupil allocation, and so that would be equal, so that Oregon City and Baker and LeGrand's kids would get the same value of education as everybody else did. So what then communities do to make up the difference is they have their foundations to help raise more money to, you know, if they think that that amount isn't enough, then they figure out where they'll do a local option levy or something like that to raise the amount.
Any more questions?
So are we done?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Unless there are any more
Thank
questions.
you.
I
That
think
was very
this-
helpful.
This was very helpful, thank you.
very much.
Yeah,
Is there
yeah.
a way we can get this presentation?
Eric has it, so he can send it to you.
Thank you so
You'll
much.
see at the end of it, I have all the slides of other cities, and I think you're probably out of time tonight, but you can look at those and, you know, see what
And then
some of the
can
cities
you-
are doing.
Can you also send to Eric about the information that you had developed about the?
Yes. And it, you know, if you want, I can make it for Oregon City, or I can just send you what I did for Gold Beach, and, well, Eric and I will talk about that.
Okay,
But yes.
perfect, thank
Or
you.
you can go on my website,
Okay.
ElaineHowardConsulting.com. There's a resources tab, and under the resources tab, I have some different things I've developed. So the Gold Beach one's there. There's an article on compression there. It took me years to figure out what compression was, and then I finally figured it out. I tried to put it down in writing and sent it to the Multnomah County tax supervising head guy and said, okay, do I have it now? And so I put that there. And then there's a really nice document that my staff just produced, is History of Oregon Urban Renewal from 2002 to 2012. So it has case studies of a lot of different urban renewal districts. It talks about some of the different issues, so you might be interested in looking at that. So,
Thank you.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very
Thank
informative.
you.
This was
Yes.
great. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, let's move along to the consent agenda.
So moved.
How do you do this? Turn it on and off
This.
again.
No, right here. This thing.
Commissioner
hit
Neely,
it
if you
again.
can touch your, and state into the record, okay. And a second?
I will second that.
Just a consent agenda.
What are we voting on?
Consent agenda.
Consent agenda.
It's just some minutes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Nancy, can I ask a question?
Sure.
There's some change in this where we can get recognized from a different screen. What is, where?
What
You
do you
got to
want to do?
request to
Request
speak
to
there,
speak.
or you got to request to speak there.
Okay.
So
great.
any screen I
see it.
think gives it
Okay,
to you.
thanks. Okay, future agenda items. Does anyone have future agenda items they want to bring to the dais?
Yes.
Okay.
I would like to discuss the McLaughlin Enhancement Project. It is my opinion that if we're, and I say that my opinion, that if we we need to have some improvements in transportation capacity for cars coming through there, and it affects the cars that would turn into Dunes Drive and might circle around to the Cove area, or any of the development that might go on to Main Street, come back through there. Right now, we have significant congestion that backs up in peak periods, particularly the PM peak period, where it could back clear across the Clackamas River Bridge and destroy our ability for cars and trucks to get into the Clackamas Cove.
If I might, it's not on the agenda yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you don't want to. You want to save your argument for that. That way we can have it noticed.
I'd like to just have it
Sure.
talked out and thought out.
Just a question, you're seeking then to have urban renewal funds address this?
I don't know. I just, right now, there's approximately $5 million being scheduled for this project. The question is it a priority for
Is that
us to
through the
think about?
commission, or is that through the urban renewal?
Total.
We have a urban renewal commission
Country.
budget process.
Yep.
Just several hours away from here now, and we'll be presenting the budget to you, and that probably be a great time to talk about that project, because there is some money in.
There is urban renewal money in that
Yes.
project.
Yes,
Right now.
and it's obligated, by prior
Yeah.
agreements,
Okay.
but you
Yeah.
can talk about it then.
Okay, great. So we can put it on that agenda.
Right.
Any other future agenda items? None? City managers report.
Nothing to report this evening?
Nothing to report. Does anybody else have anything to report? Commissioner Smith, since you're here.